We're looking at a hidden, honestly surprising historical debt that completely shapes one of the most confusing relationships in the modern Middle East. You know, when you hear the name Israel, you probably immediately think of its rock-solid, unbreakable alliance with the United States. But, as we're going to see today, the actual history of Israel's survival is deeply, deeply intertwined with a completely different global superpower. Just look at the wild geopolitical paradox we're living in right now. On one hand, you have what everyone expects, the US and Israel standing shoulder to shoulder against Russia and Iran. But the reality on the ground? It's a totally different story. Despite massive global pressure, Israel is actually held back from heavily arming Ukraine. And even wilder, in Syria, where Russian and Israeli forces are literally operating dangerously close to each other on opposing sides, they actively avoid attacking one another. It's like an unspoken rule.
So what does this all mean? Why does Israel tread so incredibly carefully around Russia? Why not just fully lockstep with the Western Bloc? Well, to solve this modern mystery, we actually have to rewind the clock way past today's headlines.
Let's get into Section 1, the Ambassador's Reminder, an unexpected message on Independence Day.
Picture this. It's Israel's 78th anniversary of independence, right in the middle of some intense regional tension. And the Russian ambassador to Israel, Anatoly Viktorov, drops this fascinating statement. He says, "I congratulate the citizens of the State of Israel, compatriots, and friends. Moscow holds a special place in the history of the State of Israel." He's explicitly reminding them, hey, do not forget the absolute lifeline the Soviet Union threw you during your War of Independence. Russia's basically saying, we were there for you when literally no one else was.
And that word he used, compatriots, is so deliberate. He didn't just casually say allies. Compatriots means people originating from the exact same homeland. You see, today, a huge chunk of Israel's population has Russian ancestry, or even holds dual citizenship. These nations actually share bloodlines. In fact, after decades of keeping each other at arm's length during the Cold War, they fully restored diplomatic relations in 1991, recently hitting 35 years of renewed ties.
To really grasp what the ambassador meant, we need to go to Section 2, 1948, the first ally, the chaotic birth of a nation. Let's walk through this crazy timeline. May 14, 1948, Israel declares independence the moment British forces pull out. Literally within 48 hours, on May 15th, neighboring Arab nations declare war. Israel is a brand new state with no formal allies, no real standing, and completely outgunned. But then, May 17th happens. Just 3 days after declaring independence, the Soviet Union steps up and grants Israel full, legally binding recognition. 3 days.
Now this point right here shatters a massive historical myth. Honestly, almost everyone assumes America was Israel's very first true backer. But while US President Harry Truman did give immediate de facto recognition, mostly due to pressure back home, he totally hesitated to make it permanent and legally binding. The US actually dragged its feet for 8 long months, delaying full recognition until January 1949. It was Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union who were the absolute first in the world to formally recognize Israel's sovereignty.
And the Soviets didn't just hand over a piece of paper, they handed over a literal lifeline. While Israel was fighting just to survive, they got a massive influx of weapons from the Soviet Union, funneled through Czechoslovakia. We're talking 40 tons of mortars, machine guns, rifles, ammunition. They even shipped over 25 Avia S-199 fighter planes. It's wild to think about, but Israel miraculously won its very first war for survival using, quite literally, Soviet weaponry.
But you know, this bond didn't just magically appear out of nowhere in 1948. Let's look at Section 3, World War II Survival, a refuge before the state. 5 million. As Hitler's forces were tearing across Europe and orchestrating those horrific concentration camps, a massive wave of Jewish refugees fled east toward the Soviet Union. Stalin actually welcomed them, and the Soviet Union ended up sheltering roughly 5 million Jewish lives from Nazi persecution. And when the dust finally settled after the war, so many of those survivors headed straight to Israel to help build the new nation from the ground up.
And it wasn't just about finding a safe haven either. Over 500,000 Jewish soldiers served directly in the Soviet Red Army. 500,000. They fought fiercely, side by side with Russian troops, to crush Nazi Germany, going all the way to the siege of Berlin. That kind of shared blood, that shared victory, it forged an unbreakable foundational bond between them.
But, as we know, history loves a plot twist. Moving to Section 4, the pivot to the West, economics over ideology.
You're probably thinking to yourself right now, wait a minute, if the Soviets literally saved Israel with weapons and recognition, why on earth did Israel become best friends with the United States? It's a completely fair question, and the answer really comes down to the fundamental ways these two societies functioned.
It was a massive ideological clash. Think about Soviet communism. Decades prior, Vladimir Lenin himself wrote that Zionism was this capitalist, bourgeois concept that went completely against the working class. Now, they didn't hate the Jewish people, but the communists absolutely hated their reliance on private enterprise, banking, and trade. On the flip side, you have Western capitalism. Israel was a tiny, incredibly vulnerable new nation that desperately needed capital just to keep the lights on. The major Zionist leaders, the bankers, the big trade networks, they were all sitting in the US and the UK. So Israel had to make a tough call. Choose economic survival over communist ideology.
And boy, did that choice pay off to the tune of about $300 billion. That's the staggering, mind-boggling, estimated total of U.S. aid given to Israel over the decades. I mean, that's more than America has given to almost any other country on the planet. As Israel pivoted westward to secure that funding, the Cold War lines firmly locked into place. To balance the scales, the Soviet Union pivoted too, throwing its heavy support behind Arab states like Egypt and Syria.
Which brings us right up to today. Section 5, a complex, modern bond, when history meets present day. So despite standing on totally opposite sides of the Cold War chessboard for decades, they never actually became absolute enemies. They formally restored ties back in 1991. Flash forward to 2020, and you've got direct, high-level meetings between Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu. Because of those deep cultural roots, those millions of shared citizens we talked about earlier, there's this invisible buffer. Israel absolutely hasn't forgotten who handed them the rifles in 1948. And Russia? They definitely haven't forgotten the 500,000 Jewish soldiers who helped them defeat the Nazis.
Which leaves us with a really provocative question to wrap up this explainer. As new, highly tense global lines are being drawn today, what's ultimately going to decide the future of the Middle East? Is it going to be these powerful, highly lucrative modern alliances with the West? Or is it the deep, unpayable historical debts owed to the East? Definitely keep this complicated history in the back of your mind the next time you watch the geopolitical chessboard shift. Thanks for diving into this explainer with me.